episode 230. Welcome to Data Skeptic, a podcast about data science and fake news from an algorithmic perspective. Here's your host, Kyle Polich.
Coming to you from an undisclosed location in the Los Angeles area, welcome to the podcast famous for resolving gold box conjecture. This is Data Skeptic, and you're listening to our ongoing series on fake news. Today I'll be interviewing Steven Sloman, a professor of cognitive, linguistic, and psychological sciences at Brown University, and the current editor-in-chief of the journal Cognition. He's the author of several books, including my favorite, The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. This was one of the books that really got me thinking about fake news, so I was glad to have the opportunity to speak with Steven on his research.
People define fake news in very different ways, and so I think it's important not to get too caught up in the definition. There's a sense in which fake news is like pornography. That is, you know it when you see it. I'm not one who believes that we have direct access to reality and some things are true and other things are clearly false. Nevertheless, there are certain things we're told that are grounded in empirical reality, and there are other things in which people are trying to intentionally deceive us about. And I think fake news refers to the latter kind of thing.
Do you think that this is a new phenomenon? Obviously, it's in the public consciousness, but is something fundamentally different today than it was maybe 20 years ago?
Well, something is fundamentally different, but no, it's not a new phenomenon. In fact, I think it's hundreds, if not thousands of years old. People have been trying to deceive one another by telling them stories about the horrible things the enemy has done, for instance, since time immemorial. And in fact, Walter Lippmann wrote a book in 1922 describing propaganda in World War I that was clearly descriptions of events that did not occur and descriptions of people who were nothing like those descriptions. And moreover, there's a history of stereotypes and caricatures of all kinds of people that go back hundreds of years. Fake news is part and parcel of how societies have operated since time immemorial. Clearly, technology has changed the nature of the game in more than one way. So on one hand, it's provided us untold more amount of information right? We just now have access to all kinds of information that we didn't have access to before. But information can correspond to reality, so we have more of that. And information sometimes doesn't correspond to reality, and we have more of that too. So there's a much bigger problem in sorting through all of the data that we now have on our eyeballs and at our fingertips.
So I have a little bit of a bias, I guess. I feel like I can tell fake news when I see it and that I'm not going to fall for it. And maybe that's a dangerous point of view to have. Do you find that people generally think that way, or are people aware that they're in a world that's actively working on deceiving them?
I definitely think that the cognitive system is such that when we encounter information, we naturally perceive it to be factual. Dan Gilbert's a social psychologist at Harvard who started a whole literature on this topic. He distinguished what he called the Cartesian view of truth with the Spinozan view of truth, where Descartes said, we encounter a fact and we decide whether it's true or false. If it's true, we accept it. If it's false, we reject it. Whereas Spinoza said, we encounter a fact, we automatically enter it into our database of knowledge, and then we might, maybe under the right circumstances, decide that it's false and throw it out. And what Gilbert's data suggests is that people are much more Spinozan than they are Cartesian, that the act of rejecting stuff is not automatic, but takes a real effort. So in that sense, we all think that the information we encounter is reality, in the same sense that we think that the stories we hear are sort of direct reflections of actual events in the world. Though I suspect it's also the case that if you ask people what proportion of the news that you are told via the media is true, they would tend to give low estimates. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the psychology of what people accept in the media and don't accept is rather complicated and depends a lot on our ideological commitments.
In my mind, there's sort of a gradient. At one extreme, there are academic publications in peer-reviewed journals with high impact factors, and that, it's not ground truth, but it's about as close as we can get to the other end, which is maybe the rags you pick up in a grocery store line. And I'm always trying to assess where a bit of information falls along that spectrum. Am I somewhat unique in that way, or do other people have these abilities to kind of place context around news when they receive it?
I wouldn't say you're unique, but I would say you're a member of a rare breed. And of course, I don't know you, Kyle. Well,
Sure.
We've never met before, and so I would really, want to test you and find out whether you're really as critical as you think you are. I'm sure you are.
Well, I didn't claim I was good at it. I just said I aspire to it.
Okay. I don't think most people do. In psychology, there's this test called the cognitive reflection test, developed by a guy named Shane Fredericks, who's now at Yale. It's 3 very simple questions, all of which have the following structure. There's a clear, intuitive answer that pops to mind, but it's an answer that's wrong. And it's not hard to find the right answer, but it does take a small amount of cognitive work. So I'll give you an example. This isn't one of the questions, but it gives you a flavor of them. How many animals of each kind did Moses load on the ark?
Well, I'm inclined to say 2, but I feel like there's a trap being set for me here.
Well, in fact, Moses didn't load any animals on the ark, right? It was Noah that loaded animals on the ark.
Aha. Mm-hmm.
So there was a trap. And the point of the example is that this simple answer, 2, pops to mind, but it doesn't take much thought, right, to discover that, yes, there's a trap and to come up with the right answer. And that's the nature of these simple questions on the cognitive reflection test. So there's an intuitive answer that you have to inhibit in order to think a little bit more to come up with the correct answer. So people who get these questions right, we can call reflective. People who don't get them right, we can call intuitive or non-reflective. And it turns out the vast majority of the population is non-reflective. Right? About 70% of Americans are non-reflective, and over 50% of MIT students are non-reflective. There are non-reflective people everywhere in every discipline, in every area of life. And what the data show is that non-reflective people are much less likely to deliberate about what they encounter. And so they're much less likely to evaluate fake news and decide whether it's true and false. They're much more likely to just accept it and go on with their day. Which is not unreasonable in a way, right? I mean, the vast majority of information you encounter in the day, you just accept and go on with. You don't question everything. Yes, you should be critical of news, but that requires putting news into a special category. It requires a real thoughtful act in order to be critical. And even with news, you can't do it all the time. It would just take too much time.
So from the statistics you gave, if we consider non-reflective people to be sort of an ailment, then it's rather prolific in culture. Is that something you think we should be working on, better educating people trying to develop these skills? Or do we just need to have a society that works within the construct of knowing people are like this?
I would say mostly the latter. I do not want to say non-reflectivity is an ailment. Any trait that 70% of people have, I would not want to call an ailment.
Fair enough, yeah.
There's a reason that we're not reflective about everything. It takes time to be reflective. It takes resources to be reflective, and it inhibits other kinds of processes that we might want to engage in, right? It might make us less creative to be reflective. So we have to trade off deliberating and being critical of everything with all of our other goals in life. So, of course, we want to teach people critical reasoning strategies in the sense that when there's an opportune time to be reflective or to be critical, people should know what to do. I got to tell you, though, it feels to me like that's not really the critical problem with fake news. Now, if I come across something, so if I'm standing in line in the grocery store, then that's one thing. But if I'm sitting at my computer and come across some wild claim, I don't generally find it really hard to discover whether it's true or false. I mean, there are websites you can go to, but you can also just Google it and see whether credible organizations are reporting it as well. Critical reasoning skills are important. I actually think there are two other things which are more important. One is just making people aware that critical reasoning requires effort. It's something you do have to think about. It's something that you do have to learn to do because there are biases built into the cognitive system. But I think even more important than that, we don't want to just focus on individuals. We have to focus on the culture. Individuals fundamentally don't think alone, but we're constantly dependent on others for information, for all kinds of cognitive processing, for remembering things, for doing calculations. There's a sense in which whenever we do anything, we do it as a community. And so if we're going to be critical, since we can't be critical all the time, we have to be reminded by others when to be critical. What we really need more than anything is a culture in which it's okay to say to someone, is that true? Where did you learn that? Is that credible? Is that plausible? Here's a reason why that might be wrong, right? There are communities already in which I think that is the norm. Effective scientific lab meetings are like that. People are constantly being challenged. People make claims and other people scratch their heads and are skeptical. Any sort of philosophical debate is also like that. It's okay to be skeptical. So I feel like that is the closest thing we can come to a silver bullet to solve this problem of fake news, to allow a culture which allows skepticism. I guess you know that already, given the name of your organization.
Well, we aspire to that as well, yeah. So we're touching on a lot of the topics mentioned in your book, The Knowledge Illusion, which I think is a great read. I definitely want to recommend to listeners to check out. Let's start there. Could you tell me a little bit about the book and what you cover in it?
The book is a twofold argument where we point out that as individuals, we're relatively ignorant and that we don't understand fully how ignorant we are, that we think we understand how things work better than we actually do. So that's the one theme of the book. The second theme is an attempt to explain, given that individuals are ignorant, how is it that humanity is able to accomplish so much? We operate within a community of knowledge. There's a division of cognitive labor such that whenever we do anything, we do things as a group. We cover a lot of data from cognitive science and other areas, and a big part of the book is drawing out implications of this view for politics, for education, for our relationship with technology, for decision-making, and for one or two other things that are slipping my mind at the moment.
So I think the book really does build that case very strongly, and I didn't find a point that I thought was particularly controversial in that regard, that, you know, people are in certain ways ignorant and that we get past that with communities of knowledge. Is this a radical new idea in your field, or is it kind of something the researchers have been migrating towards for a while?
It's certainly not a radical new idea. Walter Lippmann, again, had similar ideas back in 1922, and I'm sure one could find precursors of the ideas even before that. There are certainly precursors of the idea in psychology, cognitive science, and in philosophy. I actually think the importance of the idea is not so much that it's entirely novel, but that it's not consistent with the way, first, cognitive science thinks about the mind, but second, how everyday people think about the mind. In cognitive science, there's a tendency to build models of mental processing, of mental functioning, which are descriptions of what's going on inside the skull. And in fact, a lot of people now are doing this at the neural level. That is, they're building models of how the brain works. And those models are in some sense replacing a lot of the theorizing that's gone on in cognitive science. This way of thinking of everything being inside the skull I find deeply wrong-headed. If we really want to understand how human beings process information, we have to think about things at a much higher level. We have to think about interactions between people. It's not revolutionary in cognitive science, but it's something that diverges from the mainstream view in cognitive science, and in fact, mainstream direction that cognitive science is moving. So human beings are always looking from the inside out. We see the environment around us, we see the world that we're living in, and we see how it impinges on us as individuals. We see what we bring to the table, and it always seems different than what others are bringing to the table. And so it's very natural for individual human beings to think about their own mental processes as things that are going on inside their brain. In fact, we argue in the book, it turns out that many of the conclusions we come to, the inferences we make, the decisions we make, the actions we take are a function not only of brain processes, but of all kinds of other stuff going on in our bodies, in the world, and in other people's minds. We outsource a lot of the information processing we need to do. We want to know whether a policy is good or bad. We don't just think it through, but we see what the people we respect think. And in fact, that's the right thing to do. I happen to be a great believer in climate change, but it's not because I can give you a super sophisticated analysis of how and why the earth is warming and what the consequences of that are. I mean, that's just not the kind of scientist I am. Mm-hmm. I rely on the knowledge that other scientists have, and I incorporate it. I'm not fully aware of the degree to which I incorporate other people's thinking and other people's beliefs into my own.
When you put it that way, it seems like a strength of our culture in a way to me. I mean, if you asked me, how does a computer work, something I have some expertise in, I can tell you a great deal of information, but at some level, I don't know how the transistor is actually manufactured, but I know someone else out there knows it and takes care of that for me. So in that regard, is this way that we share collective knowledge, can we measure it? Can we ascribe any sort of properties to it that we want to study, and how maybe scientifically aware a culture is, even if its individual people aren't up to speed on the latest and greatest?
That's an interesting question. We are studying it in many ways. The way my lab is focusing on the issue is by trying to figure out the ways in which people outsource problems without being aware that they're outsourcing those problems. I have a grad student, Babak Hamatian, who has shown that we often use single words as satisfactory explanations for things, right? So I'll give you an example that's not from his studies, but it'll give you a sense of what he's doing. So someone might say, why is this food healthy? And someone else might answer, because it's organic. Well, I would argue that organic actually doesn't carry a lot of information.
It's made of carbon, right?
Well, okay, so it tells you that, but that's a fact that you probably already knew, right? That it was made of carbon. And, people use organic to mean multiple different things. Yes. I lived in California for a while, and there's sort of 5 different levels of organicity in Berkeley, right? Depending on which supermarket you go to. People mean very different things by it. And yet, if you say it, it turns out people think that's a satisfactory explanation. In general, words serve as satisfactory explanations if those words are entrenched in a community, and not if those words are not entrenched in a community. So what Babak has shown is he comes up with situations where the word literally has 0 informational value, informational content. It carries 0 bits of information. But if the community uses the word, people will say it's a satisfactory explanation. And if someone just has come up with the word on their own, then it's not a satisfactory explanation. So that's one example of how we outsource judgments that we have to make to other people without really being aware that we're doing so. I could go on with examples if you want me to.
Sure, absolutely.
So another one is work that my colleague Eleanor Amit has done, in which she shows that you describe an act by someone, like the CEO is selling some drug, and the drug either has a seriously harmful effect or it has a not such a bad effect. It's still bad, but not so bad. Moreover, we tell people either selling the drug is legal or selling the drug is illegal. And then we say, how bad is this act? On a scale from 1 to 7, how morally acceptable is what the CEO did? People don't care at all about the impact of the drug. That is, the impact of the drug has zero influence on people's judgments of moral acceptability. What matters to people is whether the act was legal or illegal. It's quite shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, the data are really quite powerful. You know, it's important to understand that they only see one impact or the other, and they only learn whether it is legal or illegal. They don't get a variety. They're not comparing one situation to another. Our explanation for this is that people appeal to legality because it allows them to outsource this very difficult question of how moral the action is. Instead of answering the question, how moral is this action, they're able to answer a much simpler question, how legal is this action? So what they're doing is outsourcing the question of morality to the people who make the law. So that's at least our hypothesis. That's another example. Here's a third example. And this is more of a sort of hypothetical example of how we outsource. You can imagine a society in which I believe I understand the effect of, say, some medical insurance policy because the people around me think they understand the effects of the medical insurance policy.
Knowledge by osmosis then, yeah.
Exactly. And we actually have some direct data that learning that other people understand does increase your own sense of understanding. So if I think I understand because the people around me think they understand, and the people around me think they understand because the people around them think they understand, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody has this sense of understanding only because they're surrounded by other people who have a sense of understanding. Then you can have an entire community with this deep sense of understanding, even though nobody understands. So that's one consequence of outsourcing and not knowing that you're outsourcing, being non-reflective about outsourcing. And to be honest, I think that is probably the most important role that fake news plays in our society. I don't think it's the information content per se. It's more that you have other people who are telling you, look at these evil people, look what they do. Right? Look at this conspiracy that's going on. I hate them. And now everyone who sees this piece of news is going to be more likely to hate them. And we have reason because, right, we understand because here's some information. The person who's obtaining the fake news doesn't necessarily fully comprehend or even accept what they're seeing, but they nevertheless are left with this sense of affiliation with the people who delivered it to them. Because they know that other people are seeing it too, there's a sense of community affiliation, which of course is to be contrasted with the target group in the fake news, which, you know, inevitably you build up resentment for. So it's just a way of polarizing people by making them feel closer to one community and more distant from another community. And indeed, polarization has increased by leaps and bounds in the last several years.
My name is Gina Nuss, and I'm a Galvanize data science alumni working at Unify Consulting.
Thanks to Galvanize for sponsoring this week's episode, and to Gina for telling her story.
I got my undergrad degree in mechanical engineering. Spent all of my career since college at Boeing. So I did a lot of different things while I was at Boeing, and I was kind of getting to a point where I was ready to try something different and wanted to experience maybe a different company, do some different stuff.
Galvanize is a collection of campuses where people can access the skills and networks they need in person to level up in data science.
For where I was at in life, having been in my career for quite a few years, I was pregnant at the time, so the idea of starting a multi-year master's program wasn't really realistic, and so I liked the idea idea of being able to go all in, do full-time intensive education for 3 months, and be able to come out the other side with a new skill set. Galvanize didn't just focus on the academics part of it, understanding not just how to develop really cool models, but from the very beginning, how to get a business understanding, how to talk to the person that you're developing a model for.
You'll be taught by industry-leading data scientists who will help you put your training to good use in developing a capstone project. Gina's involved in novel use of recommender systems.
My husband works for a local trail run company here in Seattle, Northwest Trail Runs. We're also friends with the owner, and I ended up getting to work with a real company, which is great. What we ended up doing was using a recommender system, a collaborative filtering model, to recommend top races. But since the interest was not in making recommendations to the runners, but actually providing some business insights to the owner, I took that then a step further, and we looked at which races were most often recommended in people's top 10. When we first looked at recommender systems, I thought, well, this is cool, but I don't think this is where I would want to focus. But going through the Capstone project helped me appreciate that you can apply a lot of these models in ways that are a little different than you might initially think. Being able to think outside the box and apply them in different ways was something that really stood out to me.
Learn more at galvanize.com/dataskeptic. That's galvanize.com/dataskeptic. Well, if we were to take this idea of, my confidence that I know something based on if I think people around me know it, I could describe that as a strategy, right? In one sense, I could go independently learn everything, which I'd never complete my task.
Right.
Or I could trust that, all of my neighbors seem to do an activity. It doesn't seem to be bad for them. I'll just take for granted that maybe someone out there has double-checked things and that they've arrived at the truth and I can follow their lead. Is there an issue with that strategy overall? The alternative being that, like you were saying, I have to go and learn everything myself. Right. Have we settled to this because it's sort of a game theoretic nice place to be? Is that why societies behave this way?
Oh, I'd say it more strongly than that. We've settled on, evolution has settled on this strategy because it's the only option available to us. Mm-hmm. The world's incredibly complex. And, it's not only the case that it would take our entire lifetime to learn everything we had to know to, say, make the best possible political decision. It would take our entire lifetime to learn everything we have to know about any one issue, right?
Yeah.
In order to make a wise decision. I don't even know if it's evolution so much that has built in this strategy as much as, metaphysical reality. Like the world is just so complex that we can only be specialists in some tiny, narrow little sliver of possibility. And we depend on others. We have to depend on others. We have no choice but to depend on others. So yeah, we have to use that strategy. We have no choice. But we can be aware that we're using it. Mm-hmm. So I do try to be reflective. I try to be reflective about whether news is true or false. I also try to be reflective about the source of my own beliefs. So, I suffer as much hate and resentment about certain politicians as anybody else does. I'm constantly trying to tell myself that I'm being manipulated by my own community because I think I am. That's just how communities work. And I think if we were all a little more accepting of that fact, then perhaps conversation would be a little easier. We'd be able to reach compromise a little more quickly because we'd be less confident about our own accuracy.
Speaking of confidence, there's an interesting approach you can take that I learned about in the book. When I hear things about the way in which I, like everyone else, is ignorant in many ways, it's kind of disheartening. I have this goal of believing as many true things and as few false things as possible, yet knowing that that's sort of unattainable. But one thing that really brought me some, I don't know if pleasure is the right word, but I was happy to learn about it from the book, was how you can get someone to see the light by asking them, exploring the illusion of explanatory depth. Can you tell me a little bit about the mechanisms that you can take people through there?
So this is a psychological phenomenon first uncovered by a couple of psychologists named Leon Rosenblit and Frank Kyle. And what they did was they took everyday common objects like zippers and ballpoint pens and toilets, and they asked people how well they understood how they worked. people, thought they understood that they worked on a 7-point scale. They gave numbers on average like 4 and 5. And then they said, okay, how do they work? Explain it in as much detail as you possibly can. And people hemmed and hawed and struggled and found that they were not able to give a complete explanation or anything close to a complete explanation. So when Rosenblit and Kyle again asked them, now, how well do you understand how the thing works? People lowered their judgments. In other words, people themselves admitted that beforehand they had been living in this illusion of understanding, or this illusion of explanatory depth, as Rosenblit and Kyle say, that in fact their understanding is not what they thought it was. So the process of explanation revealed to them that they don't understand. So what I did with some of my colleagues is show the same thing in the political domain. Just prior to the 2012 election, we gave people some policy issues, things that were common discourse at the time, like whether there should be a cap and trade policy on carbon emissions, whether there should be unilateral sanctions on Iran, right? Some things never change. And we asked people how well they understood the issues. We asked them to explain them. And then we found that that lowered a subsequent judgment of understanding by having people explain or try to explain how these policies would lead to consequences. We punctured their sense of understanding. What we also showed is that puncturing their sense of understanding also punctured their confidence. So people became less confident in their attitude regarding the policy after trying to explain how it worked.
Well, it seems like a very powerful mechanism, though, then, that maybe we could take advantage of.
It does, and I do think that we should take advantage of it. There are actually examples out there where we have taken advantage of it. So along with Babak, my grad student, and some others, when we look at people's attitudes towards same-sex marriage, those have changed a lot over the past 10 years, right? Since Obama took office. And what we did was we took a bunch of comments on Reddit about same-sex marriage, and we did this statistical analysis of them. We applied what's called a topic model or an LDA analysis. And we showed that over time, people discuss the topic less in terms of their sacred values and more in terms of consequences. So the nature of the discourse about same-sex marriage has changed in parallel with changes in people's attitudes. Minds change when the conversation changes from one about, people's basic, intrinsic, sacred values to one about what the actual consequences of the policy would be. If you're talking about what the Bible says about marriage or about how everyone has a fundamental right to choose who they love, then you're not going to achieve much consensus. You're not going to change anybody's mind. But if you're talking about whether having 2 fathers or 2 mothers has an effect on a child's welfare, well, that's something you can actually talk about. And it turns out that, which of those people are talking about is in a sense up to them, that you can frame issues in different ways and how you frame them will matter. So that's the positive side. I've got to be honest that it's not clear to me that one can easily scale up the kind of experiment we ran to, an entire nation's discourse. Because when you ask somebody to explain something, you kind of annoy them. People don't like being asked to explain things, especially when they can't.
Sure.
Right? People don't like having their ignorance pointed out. So they'll accept it and they'll realize they're ignorant, but then they won't want to talk to you. It's something that we should do. And actually, I think it's the media's responsibility more than anything to change the discourse from one about, basically from one about who's going to win the next election, which is 90% of what they talk about, to one about what the actual consequences of things would be. Like, how is our world working? I find it very annoying when I encounter almost all news these days, even respectable outlets, even, PBS and NPR. There's so little discussion about the gory details by which things change, by which policies are going to have effects, because it's hard to talk about that. Right? It's not always pleasant. It's a little like going to engineering class. Instead, what we talk about are what we value and what our friends think and what the polls say and, who's going to win the next election again and again and again.
Well, Stephen, I know this may seem like it's a little bit of a left turn to close out our interview, but this program, which is now focusing on fake news, has just come off of a long stretch of discussing artificial intelligence, which in a way does come up in the book. Could you leave us with a teaser about your thoughts on how machines that make decisions fit into the way in which human beings share and retain knowledge?
Well, look, it's very clear that the most important member of our community of knowledge these days is Google. Mm-hmm. Right? If we want to learn something, that's the primary place we go. And in fact, we all have dinner partners who we wish would stop going there. The internet in that sense is critically important. It has, widened our community of knowledge to an incredible degree. That's the good news. The bad news is that technology is not a member of our community in the same sense that other human beings are members of our community. Technology does not share our intentionality. So human beings have this very special ability to share goals with others, to focus attention on common goals and of ways of achieving those goals, so that we're constantly collaborating together, right? Human beings have this incredible ability to work together. And there are psychologists who argue that there's no other species that comes close to human beings in the ability to do that. What's clear is that technology is in another dimension. Technology is completely unable, for the most part, to share our intentionality. Engineers are busy trying to get Google to understand what we mean when we type in a search query. It takes a human being to really figure out what it is that another human being is trying to achieve and to step in and help them achieve that. And that's the reason that technology has led people astray so often. In the book, we cover a variety of examples of how various transportation tragedies are a result of people misusing the technology or the technology misunderstanding what the human was trying to do. When we use AI, we have to be super careful because we come more and more to depend on it, even though it's lacking this really, really important trait, the ability to figure out what in the end we're trying to accomplish.
So I think that's an excellent challenge to developers of future AI systems. Perhaps there will one day be a system where I can give it my intentions of the types of articles that I'd want related to whatever my interests are, and that it would automatically optimize to bring me as many true statements and as few false statements as possible. But until we have such machines, it seems we're going to continue living in a world where the internet brings us a mix of real and fake news. If fake news is at least partially unavoidable, what are the consequences for society?
We have a tendency to think that fake news is just information and it changes people's beliefs, right? We see this information, we update our beliefs in a way that corresponds to the fake news. It's not at all obvious that that is the consequence. The consequence may be one that's more emotional, or as I suggested earlier, it may be more about who we affiliate with, who we love, and who we hate. And it may not really affect our beliefs at all. One thing we do know is that we're much more likely to be critical of fake news that's inconsistent with our beliefs. But that may be more because the fake news is questioning our community, is questioning our team, our family, those who we love. And so we respond in a kind of emotional way. These are all open questions, and I hope we're able to answer them someday.
Yeah, me too. And I look forward to watching your future work and this topic in general. Is there a best place people can follow you online?
I have a website, the Sloman Lab website, but it's full of academic papers. I really do hope they go and read the book and read my next book when it comes out as well.
Excellent. Well, that's The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone. And be sure to give me a heads up when your next book hits the stands.
Thanks, Kyle. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic, where the news may be fake, but the data doesn't lie. Show your support by getting a t-shirt at dataskeptic.com.